Hello, everybody. Good morning. Thank you, President Jones, Chair Keeley, Ms. Timberlake-Dadamo for opening the 2021 Diversity Forum. I'm Kirsty Jenkinson. I'm an investment director here at CalPERS, and I'm really delighted to introduce and welcome Securities and Exchange Commissioner Alison Heron-Lee. Thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today and join our discussions, Commissioner Lee.
Thank you, Kirsty. It's a pleasure to be here.
Appreciate it. Great. Now, I understand that obviously you took up your position at the Commission almost exactly 2 years ago, and you also spent the first months of this year as acting chair. And so for followers of the SEC, and I know there are many tuned in today, it's clear that there's a lot of activity underway right now at the Commission relating to environmental, social and governance, or ESG risks, that CalPERS and CalSTRS believe are really important drivers in understanding value and making investment decision making. And particularly, there was a focus from you on climate change and human capital management, including diversity. So with that sort of framing, let's start with perhaps your perspective on how you see diversity, equity and inclusion as being relevant to the SEC's core mission.
Sure. Again, thank you for having me today. And thanks, I want to thank CalSTRS for addressing this just profoundly important topic, because I'll tell you, whether I'm wearing a policy-making hat or not, diversity, equity, and inclusion is just fundamentally about basic fairness. So long before I was sworn into the SEC, it's a topic that I've had a lot of focus and interest on. I have 4 daughters, and so it's something I've been focused on for a long time. But it's also one of the most powerful tools that any organization has to enhance its own effectiveness. That's true for private entities, public, governments, academics. We are at our best and can fulfill our missions best when our workforce reflects a full diversity of thought, backgrounds, and expertise and experiences. And when we can foster an equality of opportunity in our ranks and create an environment where everyone can develop and succeed. That's true for us at the SEC, just like it is anywhere else. So I would say that the most immediate way that diversity is relevant to our mission is as it relates to our own internal DEI practices. We had an event at the SEC earlier this year, you may have read about it, where we had Georgetown professor Chris Brummer, who had done a lot of important research on the dearth of Black financial regulators historically. And he identified the fact that, he had expanded his research to show that, at the SEC at the time of his research, we'd only had 2 Black division directors in the history of the agency. So that the numbers are stark and troubling in terms of our ability to do our jobs well and to do them right. And so, I will say we've made some progress, and I'm very pleased. You may know that we welcomed Renee Jones recently. In fact, I think she started yesterday as our head of the Division of Corporation Finance. So I'm really, really pleased to see some improvement on that. But we still have a lot of work to do, I think, at the SEC on all levels. But apart from our internal practices, of course, it's relevant to our mission in a number of other ways. So the industries that we regulate, brokerage, asset management industry, there's a notable lack of diversity, particularly at the senior management levels of these SEC registered entities. Part of our mission is also, as you know, capital formation. There are notable disparities in access to capital for women and minority-owned firms. Our mission, of course, includes protecting investors, and our investor advisory committee recently recommended that we look for ways to enhance investment opportunity for minority and underserved communities. And of course, diversity comes into play in connection with our public company disclosure regime. And whether we should enhance diversity disclosure requirements, which I'm sure we'll talk more about today, but that's just a way of saying it intersects with our mission at numerous points. And I think it's actually one of the most important topics that we should be focused on today at the SEC. And investors seem to think the same thing.
Absolutely, yes. And that's a great overview of just the breadth of the regulatory regime that you oversee at the SEC. I suppose maybe where have you experienced, and if you do experience pushback, that the SEC is not, that diversity is not necessarily aligned with the SEC's mission of protecting investors specifically? How do you respond to that when perhaps you do get that challenge?
So I've heard that on a number of other issues as well, but we certainly hear it, that this idea that it's a social cause, and it's not, as a result, it shouldn't be a focus for regulators. I gotta say, I've long been of the view that it really makes no economic sense that we should have to justify diversity and inclusion. In other words, that there should be a need to explain why it's important not to exclude entire segments of our population from realizing their economic potential. That seems to me that that should be the baseline, and anything that deviates from that requires justification. That's kind of where I come at it from the start. But when it comes to the disclosure regime, there has been this notion that some topics like diversity fall under this social or ethical umbrella, but that is just increasingly belied by the data. I know you know this. I've done a survey of academic, literature and research out there. There's a big McKinsey study out, for example, that finds that companies with the greatest ethnic diversity on their executive teams outperform those with the least diversity by something like 35%, in profitability. So it's just one example where you can just see it in stark financial terms. And that's why we're seeing diversity metrics get incorporated into investment analysis. I've spoken to quants who said to me, I put diversity info into my algos. We're seeing investors increasingly demand this information from companies, and we're seeing shareholder proposals on diversity and racial justice issues. And those are not just getting on the ballot, but they're getting significant support. So in my view, I think we're past the point of dismissing diversity as a kind of a niche social cause. I think it's quite plainly relevant to investors, to financial performance, to markets, to the economy. And so it's relevant to us as regulators.
Yeah, absolutely. And so clearly as you say, this is like, we're beyond that time of having to have that discussion. It's about how do we do this better and how do we think about, really integrating it efficiently into the investment decision making and broader processes, I think that we're all privy to. You touched a little bit about, the role of the SEC as a regulator. I think an interesting issue maybe to explore is what specific role can a regulator play? And is there a place for greater coordination between regulatory bodies and federal agencies on topics like diversity, equity, and inclusion? We're seeing it a little bit, obviously, in this sort of whole of government approach to climate that the current administration is pursuing. Wondering if there are any parallels that you see with diversity as well.
Yeah, that is a really thoughtful question. I like it because I think it's important for us to think about and focus on that. I can tell you that, for example, with climate, it's been clear to me that we need to be sort of cooperating with the substantive regulators. Like in my own personal view is we need to be reaching out to the EPA, making sure we understand, coordinating with them and the like. Diversity is no different. I think that the certain so-called kind of social issues that may not traditionally have been viewed as having a market-wide significance, and so maybe that's why they've not gotten the attention they deserve in terms of regulatory cooperation. But if you think about long-term sustainable growth for the economy, you know that issues of racial equity and economic justice are crucial, and so they should be the focus of cooperation, regulatory cooperation, both in terms of multilateral cooperation through mechanisms like FSOC, and then informally just among regulators. I think, where there's jurisdictional overlap. I mean, think, for example, about the fact that we've got disparities, I mentioned earlier, in access to capital for minority and women-owned business. That issue is relevant to us at the SEC, but it also implicates the availability of credit and lending practices. It's connected to infrastructure issues like broadband in certain parts of the country. So, it cuts across numerous jurisdictional and agency lines, and so it's prime in my view for regulatory cooperation, and I think you're going to see more of that. You may know that the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission has that form EEO1.
Yes.
And that, I think, has relevance to our potential rulemaking on human capital. We should be thinking about whether we leverage that data as we think about disclosure requirements. That's something that companies are already keeping. Is it the right data? Is it the right data for them? Is it the right data for us? I know, for example, that that data doesn't include disability data, so it would be good to understand from the EEOC kind of what's going on there. Why is that the case? Have they thought it through? We should be talking about and thinking about these things. So I really appreciate that question. I think it's good to remind regulators that we should always be working together. We should always be looking for ways to cooperate, but there are certain very specific areas like diversity where I think we can really leverage regulatory cooperation.
Great, thank you. And I think, yeah, picking up on that point that you made specifically about working with the Equal Employment Office on this, again, it's like it might not be the perfect data as it stands for everybody across the board, but at least it's an initial step for a building block to the future path that we want to see maybe proceeded. So I appreciate you thinking of that for sure. Maybe a little bit about a speech that I know many others read avidly from that you made at the Council of Institutional Investors full conference last year. You highlighted that disclosure works, and you've touched on this already in your initial comments, and therefore perhaps the most obvious tool in the SEC's toolbox for influencing change on diversity is around disclosure. And then last month in another speech entitled Myths, Misconceptions and Materiality, you particularly focused again on ESG related disclosure. So let's dive in a bit to those sort of two topics. Firstly, to sort of set the scene, can you comment on the SEC's principle around disclosure and materiality? Because I think that sort of, provides a foundation for this discussion.
Sure. So as you know, one of our core responsibilities at the SEC is public company disclosure rules. And so that means ensuring investors get the information they need to price risk and allocate capital. So materiality is an important concept in our disclosure rules, and it serves in many instances as like a qualifier to certain disclosure requirements. So we might tell companies, you need to disclose on a specific topic to the extent that it's material to your business. And that's what we call principles-based disclosure. So we sort of identify a topic, we say, if this is material to you, disclose what is material about it, to your specific business. So it factors into the topics that we choose to require disclosure on. And as we choose disclosure topics, we consider the evidence regarding the materiality broadly of a topic, like maybe executive comp or cybersecurity or human capital. So we evaluate the topics, we consider what's material kind of broadly in that regard. Sometimes we look at the right time horizon for disclosure of certain risks and the like. Those are all kind of valid disclosure obligations. But it's important to note, and this is kind of what I was trying to get at in that second speech on materiality, we're not restricted by the legal principle of materiality, which is a court-created doctrine that deals with anti-fraud laws when we create specific disclosure rules. So we're not bound to demonstrate the materiality of every piece of information that we choose to require on a company-by-company basis. It's relevant, but it's not a legal or limiting factor in our rulemaking. So that's kind of the groundwork for how materiality factors into what we do. And it sounded like maybe you had a second part to your question.
Absolutely, yeah. That was sort of just to make sure for all of our listeners that we understand where the materiality rule fits within your rulemaking. But it's clearly a complex topic. And I imagine challenges in setting disclosure rules that align with these principles brings challenges as well. So how do you seek to overcome those? And I think, again, when you talked about the myths and the misconceptions of materiality, you laid out a number of the challenges that you see that might not be as big a challenge in reality because it's a bit of a myth. Maybe talk us through some of those reflections.
So the challenge in many ways is getting the balance right between principles-based structure, which is important because it provides not just flexibility, but tailored information about individual companies, and then more prescriptive or kind of line item type requirements, often called metrics. So that is always a challenge, is sort of getting that balance right. And that's what I think, that's where public comment comes in and is extremely helpful. That's where, and especially from investors who can tell us how they use the data and why, and then that will help us understand what's most important, where are the places that principles-based is leaving significant gaps, if in fact it is on any particular given topic. So I think that's one big challenge. I think another big challenge that we face is in accurately weighing the costs and benefits. There's an awful lot of focus on the cost of disclosure, and that's understandable and rightly so. Companies are in a very good position to tell us how much it's going to cost them to sort of put information together, but companies are not necessarily in the best position to tell us what the value of those disclosures are, or to tell us what the costs of not disclosing that information are. And we need to step up and do a good, thorough, careful job of making that analysis, that side of the equation. That's a challenge. Making sure that we've identified the cost of fraud, the cost of, of investors not necessarily being able to allocate risk appropriately and in the way that they, allocate capital and price risk appropriately. Those are the kinds of things that present a challenge, and one that I know our agency is up to, but that they will rise to, and they're working on, and will continue to do so. But it's there are numerous challenges in getting it right.
I think let's come back to the sort of the first point, because I like where you split those two out, really. The first one really is this sort of the tension between principles and sort of specific metrics-based disclosure. And it's interesting, obviously last year, amendments were adopted to Regulation SK, which is to modernize how companies and issuers disclose and describe their businesses, their legal proceedings and risk factors. And within this process, I know the SEC added human capital as a broad topic of possible disclosure, but you noted the final rule was pretty boldly silent on the critical subjects of diversity and climate risk. So I'd encourage the audience to read that statement on Reg SK and ESG disclosures, because it made a number of key points, I think. So it appears that some issuers have taken this new guidance under Reg SK to include more workforce diversity data, but many haven't. And so we're sort of in a situation right now, and I know it's still early days, that perhaps the current principles-based approach, without articulating specifics, results in a bit of fragmentation, and disclosures are therefore hard to sort of compare for us as investors. So why do you think companies are hesitant to disclose workforce diversity and other diversity-related data in their SK filings?
Yeah, well, so what you described with human capital is a good example of potentially the limits of this kind of broad-based, materiality-based rule, that such as the one we introduced last year. We said, disclose on the topic if you think it's material, and if you think it's material, disclose what you want to, essentially. So as a result, as you've noted, some companies aren't disclosing anything, and then there's a wide variety in the content of what is disclosed. And one thing we know too about principles-based disclosure over time is that even companies will make changes in what they disclose from period to period. So as to why that leaves huge lack of comparability, as you pointed out, and that can be a problem on issues as important, for example, as diversity. But why they don't disclose it, presumably, it's because they don't think the information is material to them, on an individual basis. But we can't escape the notion that companies they naturally tend toward disclosure of information that puts them in a good light, and not that which does the opposite. So, I think on this point, on the human capital rule, I don't think we got the balance right there. That I said so at the time that we did it, and I continue to think that's true. There's a need for principles-based rules for the flexibility and as I said, the kind of tailored information, but it needs to be balanced with decision useful metrics that will, that can provide the kind of comparability that investors need. So human capital, is clearly a topic that lends itself to certain metrics. There's a variety, there's variability among sectors and companies that can, and should be accounted for. But I think the comment file shows amply that there are certain basic metrics that can be required across the board. And in many cases, as I mentioned, the EEO1 data, it's metrics that companies are already keeping. So I think it's my own personal view. I should have said at the beginning, but I think it's understood. I'm only speaking for myself, not for my fellow commissioners or the staff of the commission, but my own view. There are some very useful, decision useful metrics that companies are already keeping that investors would greatly benefit from having access to.
Right, yeah, and perhaps picking up a little bit on that, and I'm not going to try and ask you to front run the commission's work, but I do note obviously that the topics of board diversity and human capital management, including, as Chair Gensler recently indicated, this topic of improved workforce disclosures, they're listed now as priorities in your updated rulemaking plans alongside climate risk. So there clearly is a direction of travel at the moment at the Commission. Maybe you could provide us with a little bit more information on How do you hope the SEC can best ensure that companies provide these types of disclosures and get that balance right going forward on these topics?
Well, as you mentioned, it's on the regulatory agenda. I was very pleased to see that. And what I hope will happen next is that we will see a rule proposal. We have a lot of information now. There is one question even in the open public comment period about what other ESG metrics might be needed, and we have gotten a lot of input on that. So there's information in the comment file that I opened in March that right now on potential diversity disclosures that investors need, but we had some even before that from other releases, concept releases and things that we've done over time. So we have a fair amount of information from which we could construct a rule proposal and a lot of feedback from people falling on both sides of the spectrum. We've got folks who think the status quo is fine, folks who think it's too much already, folks who are explaining why. That's our job, is to sift through all of that and make sure we take it all into account, make sure that we weigh that carefully, the costs and benefits. And then what I hope we'll see is a rule proposal. And again, when that happens, there'll be yet another public comment period before the rule is finalized. These are not simple issues, so it's helpful to give as much public comment and feedback as we can, including data, wherever that's possible from the public. So that's what I hope will happen. That's what I think and expect we will see. Like I said, I was very pleased to see it on the regulatory agenda.
Great. Absolutely. I think many of us obviously were as well. So very supportive and obviously eager to continue to provide that feedback that you're obviously looking for as well. I think, and I won't dwell too long on this, although just to bring it back again, the second challenge you did touch on, and we hear it a lot from companies, I think, is that cost balance, the sort of effectiveness is like, are you creating rules or disclosure rules that are too onerous for smaller companies, for private companies that perhaps don't have the mega staffs focused on data gathering and reporting? That's something we hear from the portfolio companies that we invest in. I'm sure it's one that you were alluding to when you talked about cost effectiveness. Maybe touch a little bit on the comment of the big company disclosures versus small company disclosures across the suite of the spectrum of the investment markets, how to manage that. And is it one size fits all for everybody, or are there kind of, ways to kind of tackle that challenge of the smaller companies?
So the answer, big picture, is yes. We're quite good at doing that, I think, at understanding how to tailor our rules. We've got two different forms. We've got emerging growth companies. We've got smaller. I'm forgetting the exact term now, but it's in the well-known seasoned issuer. We have a rung below that. So we know how to scale disclosures. We can phase them in. There are a number of different approaches that we can take to helping companies get up to speed and potentially reduce some of the costs at a point in time in the company's life when they're less able to bear those costs. But again, I think we have to make sure that we keep our eye on the ball, and then that we are actually properly considering the benefits of the rule that we're looking at. And I think that's a place where we need to bring greater focus. Nevertheless, we're quite mindful of the need to ensure that our regime makes sense, that it's tailored to the needs of not just investors, but also to the issuers, to the folks who have to prepare and produce the data. So, we need to listen to them. We need to look at and think about what's realistic. And I think we do that. I think we have a history of doing that. And I think, climate in particular is going to lend itself to that. I'm not sure about diversity. I would have to think about that. And certainly I'm open to it. I would have to hear what companies might want to offer on that point in terms of potentially scaling it. As I said, so many companies already keep a fair amount of EEO data. But I'm open to the idea that maybe we need some kind of scaling, and I'll certainly listen to that when it comes to our disclosure proposal.
Okay, great. Well, maybe in the final few moments we have left here, I'll turn the tables a little and focus now a little bit more on what you hope from the investor community and the role that we play. We're obviously the users of the disclosure from issuers or the companies in our portfolio that we've talked about, not least regarding diversity, but we also play an important role in promoting diversity within our own organizations, as we heard from in the introductory comments, and in the broader investment management industry and the financial markets. So first up, what do you wish investors better understood when we consider commenting on the SEC's inquiries and proposed rules relating to ESG risks? What can we do better, and what do you wish we did differently?
So let me say that was one of the reasons that I wanted to put together my thoughts around materiality in that speech that I gave recently, was to sort of try to, there are a few messages I wanted to get across, not just to investors really, but to everyone, that just because information is material to investors, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be disclosed, because there has to be a specific duty to disclose it somewhere in the securities laws. And there isn't just this blanket requirement that if it's material, you must disclose it. That the second piece, even if there is a duty to disclose material information, if it's not specific enough and it just involves this principles-based, like a judgment that has to be made by management and those assisting management, there's a lot of room for error there. And we have a lot of experience with those errors. So, and then finally, I wanted to make sure that folks think about and understand that we are not limited legally in our disclosure rulemaking by this principle of materiality. It's relevant. We need to be thinking about it, but it is not a legal, construct that within which we must operate when we think about specific metrics. So going forward, in terms of what those are just some baseline, ideas I wanted to make sure folks had in mind. But going forward, having investors provide insight when they comment on our rules on why they use the data, how they use the data, and showing us examples. We had, for example, when we were in the most recent iteration of the resource extraction rule that we did last December, we had some great data that was submitted by a couple of portfolio analysts who said, here's exactly how I use this data. They put it into charts. They showed how it flowed through. They showed how it went into their decision-making process. That type of information, when it's available, is extremely useful and relevant. So what I would say here is, we've introduced the topic of human capital. If that's not getting the job done, explain please why. But illustrate for us what's missing. Illustrate where the information gaps are, talk about what you would do with the data, what you know about, when you are able to get your hands on that data, how you use it, sort of as much detail as possible. It is helpful to us when we sit down and put pen to paper.
Great, I think that's very clear, and hopefully taking notes and our listeners here to kind of understand exactly what you're after there. And so if that's on the content, maybe a final sort of point on how can we best support the pace of proposals, particularly around the ESG related rulemaking that we see sort of being indicated over the next few years. One is about obviously the focus, and the second is about the pace. So maybe a little bit of comment on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. We have a lot of catching up to do, in my view, which is why during my time as acting chair, I tried to do what I could to accelerate.
For which thank you.
Many of these issues. And what I would say on that is, first of all, I just think we need to, I personally would acknowledge that, the chair has come in and immediately issued a very ambitious regulatory agenda. I'm very pleased to see that. I think, I think he's, from everything I can see, I think he's very focused on getting a lot done, and he certainly has a track record of that. So I'm very optimistic where that's concerned. But what can you do from the outside? Keep the pressure on. Just keep talking to us. Keep reaching out. Talk to all of the commissioners. Let them know why it's needed. Why delay can end up being extremely problematic. Just explain it and keep the pressure on.
Great. Well, on that note, I don't think there's anything I could add to that other than to say thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate the important work that obviously the SEC does to protect investors like us and maintain fair, orderly, efficient markets, and appreciate the work that you've done, particularly on the topics that we've been talking about today, not least on human capital and on climate and they are broader. I
Thank you.
I paused. Thank
Yeah.
you. Sorry if my internet froze, everyone. Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay. Thank you. It's a pleasure.